controlled the House in 1994, 2 years before I got here, we had spent 40 years in the political wilderness, witnessing the institutionalization of the New Deal, the Great Society, and the establishment of an all-intrusive federal government. All this was done with Democratic majorities of 60, 70, and at one point 155 was the margin that Democrats created that environment in. And in 1995, when conservatives came into power, they were armed and ready to challenge the existing government, to challenge the proposals advocated at the time by the Clinton administration. In the first 100 days, conservatives passed a rescission bill eliminating dozens of government programs. They passed welfare reform and freedom to farm. They fought through a government shutdown with President Clinton and worked hard for further entitlement reforms. But as conservatives have run more and more of the government, somehow we went from being challengers of the status quo to being content with nipping around the edges of the status quo. Too often we stopped arguing about how to limit federal power and started trying to figure out how to best use federal power to achieve our purposes. With the No Child Left Behind Act, for example, we countenanced an unprecedented expansion of the federal government into local school administration. I voted for that bill, hoping that it would encourage the states to be laboratories for change. And when I did that, I violated one of my basic political beliefs that elementary and secondary education should be the responsibility of moms and dads and local school districts. As I should have predicted, we shifted focus to the wrong place. We have to always remember why we're here. We came here to cut spending. Instead, we've too often allowed it to increase. Not as much as it would have increased if we hadn't been here, but that's not really the point. Too often, we allowed it to increase. We came here to reform entitlements. Instead, too often, we've expanded them. We came to shrink the federal government, and in too many cases, we've enlarged it. We came here to promote traditional American values, and instead we've become too often accustomed to the values of Washington or the values of the elite. But our loss in the election, I think, has a significant silver lining. I think there is a true opportunity here to rededicate ourselves to the principles that brought conservatives into the political movement. We want a smaller federal government, properly limited by the Constitution. We want a federal government that does the work left to it well, instead of a government that expands its focus and does everything it does less effectively. In that Southwest Missouri discussion I mentioned to you, we want a federal government that if it defends the country, it should defend the country in the best possible way. If it delivers the mail, it should be as good as it can possibly do at delivering the mail. Whatever the federal government has left to do, it should do well, but we should be sure that we're defining the government in the proper way. Too often, the government has stood in the way of better solutions coming from individuals, coming from charities, coming from state and local government. Now, we can't start doing what we need to do by defending our current level of spending. We have to challenge every dollar spent. The last couple of years, we've been better at that than we were the previous years. With the President's help, we've held the growth of some of these discretionary domestic programs to no growth for 2 budgets now. But even that's not good enough. We need to not talk about how we need to challenge every dollar spent on every program. We should begin with the assumption that the American people know better how to spend their money than the American government does. We should begin with the assumption that American families spend their money on behalf of their family better than the government would spend it on behalf of their family. And that federal taxes should be levied only for those things that people can't better do for themselves, or for those things that can't better be done at the state and local level, and that's when the federal government should step in and do its job. If tax cuts generate so much growth that revenues go up, as they have significantly in the last 2 years, that shouldn't automatically mean the government gets to spend the extra money. It should be a reason to let taxpayers keep more of what they've earned rather than see how much bigger the federal government can be. We need to be the defenders of the taxpayers, not the defenders of the tax collectors. Defending the taxpayer can be hard for the party in power. The Washington culture pushes an ever-expanding government, not reform. When conservatives took the reins of power in 1995, We had a list of programs we were seeking to eliminate. In some instances, we were successful. The $1 billion National Helium Reserve, the $7 million Pennsylvania Avenue Corporation were eliminated. The Congress this year failed to fund, or refused to fund, on the House side, 95 programs that don't have a penny of funding, and those programs should be eliminated. But the working pressure is almost always on the other side. Cato recently came out with a study, and for every one witness before Congress that talks about eliminating programs or reducing spending, there are 145 witnesses that appear before congressional committees in favor of bigger programs and increased spending. We need a culture of change in Washington. We need to establish a culture of limited government to replace the big government culture of excess. One reform I propose we adopt would require every plan to expand federal government to be accompanied by a proposal to eliminate or reduce the size of a equal or bigger program. Let's turn this argument around. If we want to talk about a pay-go, let's talk about pay-go for spending. If you're going to propose a new program, why don't you find something in the federal government that can be eliminated? Perhaps because it's not the job of the federal government, perhaps because it's not the job of any government, perhaps because it's just not well done. In other words, let's turn the activists for big government on each other instead of letting them gang up on the taxpayer. Let those who advocate for new programs and spending become advocates for eliminating programs that don't work or shouldn't be the job of the federal government. Now, in a coffee shop in southwest Missouri, not long after I came to Congress, the consensus of the group who was giving me advice at that moment was this: Roy, when they talk about spending money in Washington, I want you to ask two questions. And the first one is this absolutely necessary for the federal government to do? And they said, and if the answer is yes, the second one is, how in the world did we get along without it up till now? Now, that's pretty good southwest Missouri common sense, and we ought to apply that standard more often than we do. Gaining control over federal spending will require more than just offsetting new spending. It will require reforms to the massive entitlement programs that are currently on autopilot. Conservatives took steps for these reforms last year with the Deficit Reduction Act, achieving $40 billion in savings across 13 major areas of federal spending, from farm programs to student loans to Medicare. While the reforms contained in the Deficit Reduction Act were not dramatic, they were perhaps the hardest things we have done in the majority, to just look at these entitlement programs and see if we can reform these programs. We need to be more effective advocates for change. We need to learn from the truly transformational success of what happened with welfare in 1996. The conservative legislation not only reshaped a massive federal program, but it also generated billions of dollars in savings to taxpayers, saved lives and neighborhoods, and has been one of the great successes of the last decade, what's happened with welfare reform. I believe our mistake in pursuing entitlement reform has been our failure to follow the welfare reform model. In the Deficit Reduction Act, remember, we looked at little savings in 13 areas. In welfare reform, conservatives sought to tackle one whole program and reform it completely. The structure of the reform had been laid out in advance by groups like the Heritage Foundation, and the need for reform had been successfully conveyed to the public so that people were ready for the kind of reforms we were talking about. In the Deficit Reduction Act, by contrast, we took on dozens of programs and tweaked each one just a little bit. Unlike welfare reform, no groundwork was in place for these changes. The reforms were not visionary. They were not transformational enough to have any impact on people wanting to see those reforms occur. Yet they were controversial enough to generate impassioned opposition from everywhere. So everybody was against it. Nobody was for it. We hadn't done the kinds of things that we need to do if we're going to be successful in the future like we were successful with welfare reform. We'll have several opportunities in the near future to return to the welfare reform model. The most important one may be a